Shalom. One moment, waiting for, okay. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. To those of you on the conference call, as well as those of you watching on Facebook, Shabbat Shalom. Today, we'll be talking about a sermon entitled Prevailing over Pandemonium. Over the last 10 days, we have seen acts of violence across the country on an unprecedented national scale. All this pandemonium came on the heels of coronavirus, the COVID-19, which has kept many people around the world sheltered in their homes for the better part of the last 3 months. And it's not over yet. This uncertainty of not knowing when this pandemic will be completely gone or cured, as well as the potential outcomes of the civil unrest, street violence, the looting, the rioting. It has left many in our country feeling a bit lost, a bit insecure, extremely concerned as to what will happen next. And will what was normal life return? And if so, when? Now, all this pressure and stress amid this severe difficulty, it has had the impact of having us looking inside of ourselves. And for some I have personally spoken to, they feel a sense of powerlessness, degrees of depression, and even feeling they have somehow failed. And so today, I'll be teaching about overcoming failure and fear, prevailing over pandemonium. And our portion today, our Torah portion, named Naso in Hebrew, meaning elevate. And Parsha Naso encompasses Numbers chapter 4, verse 21 through 7, chapter 7, verse 89, and also the book of Shoftim, Judges, chapter 13, verses 2 through 25, as well as selected passages from the book of Acts in the New Covenant, namely Acts 18, verse 18, and Acts 21, verses 17 through 26. Naso includes the laws of a Nazir in Numbers chapter 6. Nazir is a Hebrew word meaning consecrated or consecrated one, and translated usually as Nazarite. Interestingly, though, in modern Hebrew, the word Nazir means monk. And a monk is a man in a religious order who lives a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Monks have voluntarily separated themselves from the world. Separated is another meaning of Nazir. And one of the most famous Nazirites in the Bible was also one of Israel's judges. Judges were those sent to do God's work among his people as guides before the prophets. There was only one judge, though, who was a Nazirite and also had superhuman strength. And his name was Samson, Shimshon in Hebrew. Our Haftarah today is Judges chapter 13. Let's see what we can learn about trusting God in times of trouble and how we can prevail over pandemonium. Let's see what we can learn from the life and story of Shimshon, of Samson. How can we overcome what we see as failures in our lives, failures in our country? A little illustration. An elderly man had been in the woods, in the forest, for weeks by himself, camping out. Each night at dusk, he built a campfire. He boiled water for coffee. and took out his skillet to cook his dinner. As he was sitting by the fire one night, the water boiling and the deer meat sizzling, he heard a tremendous racket in the brush. The sound was like a roaring freight train, and trees fell and branches snapped, and the biggest bear he'd ever seen lumbered into the clearing. And on the bear's back was a tough-looking man holding a 7-foot live rattlesnake in his hands. And the man shouted and screamed as he brought the bear to a skidding halt, bit the head off the rattlesnake, and flung it into the brush. Then he slid off the bear's back, turned and hit the bear between the eyes, knocking him unconscious. The camper was speechless as this wild-eyed renegade walked over to the fire, tossed the boiling coffee down his throat, drank hot grease from the skillet, ate all of the venison in one gulp. As he wiped his hands with poison ivy and slapped the bear back into consciousness, he turned to the camper and said, "Partner, I'm sorry I can't stay around and visit with you a while, but I've got to keep moving because there's a real bad dude chasing me." Have you ever met a really bad dude? Have you ever met someone that just really scared you? Well, in our Haftarah today, in Judges 13, and actually through 16, and it's actually 4 chapters in the book of Judges dedicated to Samson. And in him, we meet someone that had the same kind of effect on people. In fact, an entire nation feared him, and his homeland treats him with a degree of caution. Yes, Samson is who we're talking about here. Samson was a gifted man with tremendous superhuman strength. And as we give consideration to this man, we are going to see that he was extraordinary. He was a man that God blessed with great opportunity. He had all the makings to become one of the all-time greats of the entire Bible. But even though he had great potential, a broad examination of Samson's life brings us to the conclusion that he saw himself as somewhat of a failure. Though he was greatly gifted, Samson's walk with God was somewhat erratic. His life was rampant with reckless adventures and acting on momentary impulses. His thirst for revenge and his weakness for women leads many scholars to conclude that much of Samson's life was squandered. And yet we find Samson making what many call a piece of the Bible in Hebrews 11. We find Samson in the Hall of Faith. It's like the Hall of Fame for people in the Bible. And it's in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 34. When the writer of Hebrews notes those that excelled in the demonstration of faith, he writes this: "And what more shall I say, for time would fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and also of David, Samuel, and the prophets. By faith they conquered kingdoms, administrated justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and made foreign armies flee." This is so amazing. Now, how, I wonder, does Samson get into the Hall of Faith? Let's consider the story and the life of Samson. The first component of Samson's story is that Samson was a miracle baby. Judges 13 verses 2 and 3, it says, "There was a man from Zorah, from the family of Dan, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, childless. And the angel of Adonai appeared to the woman and said to her, 'Listen, You are barren. You haven't had a child, but you will conceive and bear a son. In studies of the ancient Hebrew culture, not having children was considered a tragedy among the people. So when the angel of Adonai approaches Manoach's wife with a message about bearing a son, it's more than exciting. It was miraculous. And as is always the case in these types of circumstances in the Bible, this son was going to be special. This son would become an important leader for Israel and a blessing for his homeland. Secondly, Samson was a man with a calling. Judges 13:5, we hear the instructions for this set of godly parents. You will conceive and bear a son. Let no razor come upon his head, for the boy will be a Nazirite to God from the womb. He will begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. This is a description of the Nazirite vow. Typically, this vow was voluntary, but the scriptures do reveal a select company of which Samson is the first. Samson will later be joined by Samuel, Shmuel, and John, Yochanan the Immerser, as those who are divinely appointed to do great things for God from their conception, from the womb, Nazirites. The Nazirite vow was fulfilled by three major principles. One, the abstaining from the fruit of the vine. Secondly, refraining from cutting of the hair. And thirdly, avoiding contact with dead bodies. For Samson, becoming a Nazirite was a high privilege and a heavy responsibility. To get it right, he would have to remain humble. His duty was to achieve God's purposes, not his own. You see, the Philistines had been oppressing Israel. The real danger, though, in this oppression was that the people were unaware that it was happening. They accepted the rule of the Philistines with indifference. Samson was called on to begin the liberation that would end during the reign of King David. The second component, as we move forward, is Samson's story is also about pride. Samson grows up under the influence of his godly parents, but it's clear that he's going his own way. Samson had chutzpah, boldness. We see in Judges 14, verses 1 to 3. It says, Then Samson went down to Timnah and eyed in Timnah a woman, one of the daughters of the Philistines. And so he came back and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So now get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your kinsmen, or among all your people, that you are going to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is the right one in my eyes. That last phrase easily sums up a great deal of Samson's life. She's right in my eyes. It's a statement that is an agreement to the negative characterization of the book of Judges. The people did what was right in their own eyes. We see a whole lot of this today. Samson was a man of his time. And despite his parents' objections, he wanted this Philistine woman as a wife. She is right in his eyes. Samson was also careless about his calling. He knew the source of his superior strength. He knew that the Spirit of God drove him. He knew that he had been called to live a life of separation. Nevertheless, he chose to intermarry with a pagan woman of the enemy in direct violation of God's word and command. Not only that, he rejected the godly counsel of his own parents. And as we read in the text, we see that his commitment is compromised because he touches what is dead. He holds back information from his parents. He does what he wants to do, which brings us to the third component of Samson's story, which is punishment. Samson executed judgment on the Philistines. Judges 15 verse 15 says, he found a fresh donkey's jawbone. He took it in his hand, and with it he struck down 1,000 men. Though too often his motives were more than suspect, Samson was God's agent to bring judgment on the Philistines. He was God's agent. God's hand worked through him. And what was clear to Samson was that the Philistines were the enemies. Because he was so strong, though, he was not afraid of them. It was his destiny, however, to fight them alone. He had no human help. He had no human support. And he did not bring together any army to fight them. In fact, the men of Judah were very content to sit idly by because their preference was peaceful coexistence with the Philistines. Their faith was compromised. They would not fight for their God-given land. They would not battle for the land that they were assigned to take as their own. So in this part of the story from which our verse came, with calm courage, he walks into the Philistine camp, and in short order, he defeats his enemies single-handedly, mowing them down like grass. Samson was obviously superior to the Philistines whenever he battled them. He constantly embarrassed them, a severe blow to their pride at every confrontation. And after the battle in chapter 15, the Philistines gave up on the cycle of vengeance for the time being. And it is here that Samson became a recognized and accepted leader for the Israelites. Judges 15, verse 20. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. And this appears to be a time of peace for Samson, a time of shalom. And he walked in God's ways, and Israel had true peace and stability apart from the Philistines. But this is not the end of the story. You see, the fourth component of Samson's story is passion. Even though there's this time of peace for Israel, Samson's sinful flaw continues to dominate his soul and come to fruition. He was severely flawed when it came to women, and the Philistines figure this out. Somehow they come to know this. And so as we come to chapter 16, we find that Samson is set up. The Philistines won't try to take him out without knowing the secret of his strength, but they figure out that a woman may be able to do it. And they find the woman, Delilah. She is willing to play Samson. She's more than willing to betray his confidence. And so we find that Samson was deceived and controlled by his own lust for Delilah in chapter 16 of the book of Judges. And after attempting to find out 3 times what caused this strength, what was the source of Samson's strength, Delilah continues to harp away at the mystery. It says, and she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart. And he said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak, and I shall become like any other man. And in spite of his great strength, Samson is not strong enough to control his own impulses. He's gotten to the point that there was nothing he wouldn't do for her, living for her, not for God. So even though it was obvious here, she was laying a trap. It was obvious to Samson. He would have seen it. He would have known it. But he still went along with it. And she nags and she cries, and Samson does not sense the danger. So he tells her, and she lulls him to sleep on her lap. And what happens next? Samson's moral blindness led to his physical humiliation and his physical blindness. It says in chapter 16, she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that God had left him. Samson now knew betrayal. He now knew the betrayal he himself had been rendering toward God. And this had been visited upon himself. As Samson gave away his divine secret, the secret of his divine strength to Delilah, and then lost his hair, he also lost something even more precious. He lost the presence and power of God. He thought that he had it all under control, but instead he found that God had left from him, had gone from him. Samson was powerless. When the Philistines got a hold of him, they bored out his eyes. They put him in prison and worked him. They blinded him, bound him, and broke him. And he suffered the indignities of mutilation, incarceration, humiliation. The man God called to make a difference was now in a prison that was of his own making. And the fifth component of Samson's story is prayer. It's very important. You see, sadly, Samson became the target of derision. Chapter 16, verse 25. And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson that he may entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. And they made him stand between the pillars. And Samson became the laughing stock of the Philistines, a show for them. And this great feast was in honor of their god called Dagon. And they called for Samson to be brought out so they could ridicule him and amuse themselves. And it gave them great delight to mock Samson's God. But the hours and the days and the months in prison had not been wasted on Samson. As he languished in prison, he had reflected on his own errors. And as he came to an important conclusion, that Samson finally recognized his need for God, and he praised to Adonai. In verse 28 of chapter 16, he finally utters a prayer that shows he is not relying on himself any longer. And instead of doing what is right in his own eyes, he seeks one final chance, one last opportunity to serve God and do things that are right in God's eyes. And he asked for the power again to defeat his enemies. And here are the words of Samson's prayer. Judges 16, verse 28. Samson says, "Adonai Elohim, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, so that I may this once take revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Note that he says the word please. God honors that prayer. He restores Samson's strength, and he successfully pulls down the temple of doom. And in doing so, he becomes a true judge, a judge of truth, a judge for God, a judge of Israel, willing to sacrifice his own life in order to defeat the enemy. It is here that he is most like Yeshua, for he gives his life to defeat the enemy for the purpose of God's divine power and providence. You see, Samson's prayer was a prayer of dependence. It was a statement of faith. It was a statement of truth. It was at this final moment of Samson that I see him most like a type of Superman. They take him out in the day and they chain him between the pillars, and he's hit by the sunlight. And God gives him super strength again to perform this final task. And according to the Superman comics, the cartoons and the movies, Superman gets his power from the sun. And I am reminded of the scripture, the sun will rise with healing in its wings. And did you know that Samson's Hebrew name, Shimshon, means man of the sun? Now, what do you think? Did Samson finish well? Note what else the same writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 12. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also get rid of every weight and entangling sin. Let us run with endurance the race set before us. One thing that Samson certainly teaches us, and he teaches us well, is that he who commits sin is a slave to sin. You see, Samson kept toying with temptation. He did it his way, what was right in his eyes. He kept playing with fire, and he got burned. You see, sin promises freedom, but it delivers chains. Sin promises fulfillment, but it delivers failure. Samson squandered a great portion of his life, and even though his life looked like a failure, he didn't end it that way. He made a choice that changed everything. Samson teaches us that we must have the courage to overcome failure. We must prevail over pandemonium. As I close today, let me give an illustration. There was a visitor at a fishing dock, and he asked of an old fisherman who was sitting there, "If I were to fall in the water, would I drown?" And it was a different way of asking how deep the water was, but the fisherman had a good answer. "No," he said, "falling in the water doesn't drown anybody. It's staying under that does it." You see, too many of us are content to stay under the water, and we are drowning. And some of our countrymen today are controlled by anger, bitterness, revenge. We desire position, power, and control. We are known for jealousy and greed. But here is the great truth. We are not beyond hope. Our country is not beyond hope. This world is not beyond hope. You see, when we realize our own stupidity, relying on what is right in our own eyes, it is then that we find the strength to do the right thing, like Samson did at the end of his life. It is then that we can become who God has called us to be instead of who we want to be for ourselves, what looks right in our eyes, which is almost always evil. But we can become who God has called us to be because we have the perfect champion, one who is stronger than Samson. If we put our faith in Messiah's awesome strength, then we never have to be known for our failures in our life. In Yeshua, we know true strength and true faith. We are strong with Yeshua because he is our Samson. He is our Superman, stronger than any force in the universe, our very own eternal man of the sun with healing in his wings. Messiah empowers all of us in his great love to prevail over the pandemonium and overcome the pandemics. Remember what Paul wrote in Philippians 4:13? He said, "I can do all things through Messiah who strengthens me." You see, we can beat the anger. We can beat the spirit of evil, of revenge, the spirit of vengeance, because that spirit doesn't belong to us. God says, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay." It is not our job to do so. I pray as I close today, I pray for all of you to have the power, the wisdom, and strength of Messiah to hold on to your faith, to grab it with both hands and don't let go, and pray. Because we will get through these trials and we will prevail over pandemonium. In Yeshua's name, Shabbat Shalom, and thanks for watching. God bless you all.